Welcome to Die Hard on a Blank, the podcast where we explore the influence of Die Hard on action cinema, one action movie at a time. I'm Philip Gawthorne, and with me as always is Liam Billingham, and today's film is Drop Zone.
It's Die Hard in the skydiving world. The world of skydiving, where we jump out of planes and defeat Gary Busey and go to Florida. I don't know which one of those is the scariest. I can't decide.
Great. Yeah.
All right, wrap it up.
Yeah.
Let's wrap it up.
Good times, guys. All right,
Good
we'll see you
times.
next week. No, I am so excited about this movie. We were just talking about, like, I was weirdly getting nervous because this one's kind of had a long runway and
We've been talking about it for a while.
And it's actually a very, very special film to me. And I kind of wanted to tell a little anecdote that I think you'll find amusing about when I first saw this film.
Is this from your days at skydiving school when you were a skydiver?
That's a whole other thing. I don't really want to get into that right now. But what I will say is, so I saw this movie when it came out. So I was 13. I was 13 years old, 13 years young. And as I recall, I saw it with a dear friend of mine, Chris Nicholson, who was a high school buddy of mine. And I absolutely loved it. There was something so exhilarating about seeing this movie in the theater that is really, really lost when you watch it at home because, and again, it's a word we've talked about a lot. It was a hugely experiential movie. You felt like you were flying. You felt like you were, the way it's shot, with some of the stuff, especially in the second half, and there's some really elaborate skydiving sequences. It's like with the July 4th stuff where there's like giant rings of people, and there's a later bit where they're in these kind of like amazing, like Tron-like suits that light up. And I'm telling you, it was a truly like absolutely ecstatic kind of a cinematic experience, right? So I really, really loved it. I thought it was so satisfying, so exciting. And I went to, and then at the time, I think I just started subscribing to Empire magazine. And there was a bad review in Empire magazine. It was like a 2-star review. And I took such exception to this review that I wrote an essay at school.
Yes.
That was like a counter argument to it because I was like personally offended by this review, so I remember this, and I was trying as I've been building up to the episode, I was trying to unpack like what was going on there, because of course a critic is entitled to a review, and but what I think I took exception to was the idea that this review was going to discourage people from having the experience that I had, and I knew maybe on some level that this wouldn't be the same on video. It wouldn't be the same at home. It was something that had to be experienced in the theater for its like maximum impact. So I was really kind of like weirdly hurt and saddened by the fact that someone had kind of besmirched. It was almost like my experience had been besmirched in some way. So I would love, unfortunately, this essay is lost like tears in rain to the sands of time. I would love to
read
read it.
Evangelist.
Because
let me just get
I imagine it is hilariously, earnest and, misguided.
Well, that's a great story.
But, I thought that was worth mentioning.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's so funny because until Tuesday, I had never seen this movie. And I say that like, there's a good chance that it was like on TV. It was on TBS at some point or some channel, and I had it on the background. But my Wesley Snipes relationship, or my relationship to Wesley Snipes, is really defined by Major League Passenger 57 and Boiling Point, which
I want to get into that. Yeah, when
I don't
we get
know
to the hero
if
section.
that's a good movie, but it's certainly a movie that like lives on in my brain. And I will, man, there's so much to unpack there. First of all, I think it's kind of great that that's the movie that sort of made you a burgeoning film person, like, or like someone that would wanted to like put into words like how they felt about something. And, I listened to an interview about this film, or not an interview, excuse me, a podcast episode that described it as like, and I don't think this was an insult, like a perfectly good 2.5-star movie. But I will say that I totally think you are right that a movie like this on the big screen, because you can feel it in some of the imagery in this movie. When they're jumping out of the plane or like when they're actually skydiving, you're like, God damn it, this looks incredible. And I imagine it's stunt doubles. There's no insurance company that's going to let them do that stuff for real, right? But it's pretty amazing.
It really is. It really is.
And it makes me, every time this happens in a movie, it makes me think about another, I think, underappreciated movie that I've grown to love, The Dark Knight Rises, which a lot of people hate, and I have come to love and want to rewatch all the time. And I'm not saying it's great, but like the opening sequence of that movie is so impressive. And I saw it on IMAX and was always like, holy crap, this is like amazing. This has some of that flair to it. This movie has some of that like death-defying excitement. And that's, so like I do think that it can be hard to see the merits of a movie like this on the big screen. It can be hard to see the merits of this movie when you're only watching it, no matter how big your TV is. There's nothing like, we went and saw Aliens recently on the big screen in 70 millimeter. And I think you probably agree, like that changed my relationship to that movie because I'd never seen it on the big screen
Very
before.
different experience.
Absolutely. Yeah. But I'm really excited to talk about this because like, I think this movie has a reputation as like, I don't know if bad's the right word, but maybe forgettable, or a movie that time has forgot. But I don't think that that's necessarily a fair assessment of a movie that I'm not in love with. But that's
why I thought the angle I wanted to come at was I think that's absolutely right. Like, I think the cultural perception of this movie is this is a pretty straightforward, forgettable programmer that is mixed into the shuffle of a bunch of very similar Wesley Snipes movies and similar movies that have also explored similar territories, such as Point Break and Terminal Velocity, right? Which we've covered, and we'll talk about. Yeah,
and even movies like Aspen
tandem.
Extreme came up in an interview I listened to. Remember the film Aspen Extreme about the two guys? It's not an action movie, but it's about two guys that moved to Colorado to become ski instructors. It was like probably 93 would be my guess. There was like this this like early 90s sports thing that came
Extreme
through.
Sports was a thing.
Yeah.
And subcultures as well. Subcultures was a big thing that you identified with a certain community. And this film, it's actually an aspect of this film that I really, really like. And I think it's a little bit more successful in that regard about the subculture than Terminal Velocity, because Terminal Velocity has only got like 10 people in the entire film. Whereas this actually feels like it delves into a community. You're absolutely. And John Badham has made a lot of films that have been about very specific kind of milieus and about specific subcultures, and he does it really well. But before we get too far...
Before we do, Phil, could you give us some top-line facts about the film Drop Zone?
Yes, I'd be delighted to. So, Drop Zone had its wide release on December the 9th, 1994. It was that's less than 2 months after Terminal Velocity, which we just mentioned, which was September 23rd of that year. About 5 weeks after The River Wild, which was September 30th, and 6 years after Die Hard. It was directed by John Badham and written by Peter Barsaccini and John Bishop, based on a story by Barsaccini and Tony Griffin and Guy Manos. It stars Wesley Snipes, Yancey Butler, Gary Busey, Michael Jeter, many other great actors that we'll get to.
A lot of good actors in this movie.
Good cast, good ensemble. On an estimated budget of $45 million, it grossed $62 million. So a sort of mildly, sort of
made
small
its money
profit,
back, but probably not its marketing budget back. But I imagine it did well in home video and TV. I'm sure it made a bundle of money there.
Yeah, I certainly would have thought so. But it's funny because I actually never. I didn't buy the video. I didn't rent it, which maybe says something that subconsciously I was aware that it maybe would have lost. It would have been sort of, the experience would be diluted. I actually only revisited it a few months ago when I saw it was sort of on the horizon, and I absolutely really loved the
Wait a minute,
rewatch.
you hadn't watched it between seeing it and like a few months ago?
I don't think so.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Which is weird because most of these movies I've watched like 10, 15 times over the years.
Well, Yeah.
This one I kind of left alone for almost like it was too precious in a weird way, because the memory was quite cherished, you know?
I was thinking about that earlier today because there's a film, this is completely off the topic, but who cares? There's this film called Cold War. Have you ever seen it? It came out like 3 to 4 years ago, and it's about the relationship of a couple from like the end of World War II.
I've heard of it, yeah.
Yeah, to like over a period, maybe 20 years. And I saw it in the movie theater, and 10 minutes in, I was like, this is the best movie I've ever seen. Like, I just was obsessed. I was immediately obsessed with its themes and its ideas. And like, I talked about it to everybody, and I haven't revisited it. And it's been on Amazon Prime for years, but I'm like, that first experience was so special.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes you just sort of want to leave it there in an odd way.
No, totally. Yeah. And like, I should revisit it, especially now. And this is going to become a recurring theme on this podcast, where I recently purchased myself a 4K UHD Blu-ray player. And so now I feel like there's things I can revisit and they're going to look great, as opposed to like, you know, streaming quality or whatever. And like, that's a movie where I'm like, maybe I should, you know, rent that or buy that or like get the, you know, the high quality version of it. But like,
Lives of Others was one for me that was a bit like that, where it was like I saw it in a particularly powerful moment. It was such a powerful film.
Well, that's a devastating movie.
I just wanted to leave it there. It's not one I wanted to revisit, but it was like that experience was phenomenal.
Well, there are those incredible movies that you see that you go like, that are not, you know, whether it's theme or subject matter. But I also wonder if something like Drop Zone was just, you were like there's something interesting about one and done about movies, because there's this obsessive thing in cinephilia now where you rewatch a movie a million times. And I feel like the movies I rewatch now are not necessarily like my quote unquote the best movies I've ever seen. It's like the most entertaining. Like, you know, we joke about Tenet on this podcast. Is Tenet the greatest movie ever made? No, but or Dark Knight Rises. No, but I want to watch it all the time. Like, I want to revisit this movie.
Sometimes films that are really, really perfect are almost like you don't want to watch them that often. You actually it's actually nice to watch something that's a little bit flawed, but it's kind of a comfort blanket.
Totally. I mean, why? Yeah, and that's a whole other topic, but it's really, wow, your relationship to this movie is great, because
it's quite strong. I think it sort of was like a little bit of like my youth bottled to some extent, you know, and being sort of 13 and 13-year-old boy, I think, is probably the target audience for this film. So on that level, for me, it was just an absolute bullseye, you know.
Yeah, and super enjoyable, and like, yeah, I mean, I similarly, God, that's so interesting. Anyway, that's very, very cool. But listen, we should talk about this film's Die Hard DNA.
Yeah, it actually has quite a lot. And
it does.
Some of it it's sort of deceptive because, again, premise-wise, not necessarily the most obvious, but particularly as you get to the ending of the film, there's a lot. So the big ones that I spotted in terms of connections between this and the OG masterpiece Die Hard are as follows. We've got the rule-breaking maverick cop who has a problem with authority, of course. Highly skilled terror thieves pulling off audacious heists on skyscrapers. A quirky computer hacker who is integral to the villain's plan. But it's really the beginning and the end that are the most Die Hard-esque sections. The hijack sequence that starts the film with Gary Busey and his goons. The hijack of the plane is a classic Die Hard on a Die Hard scenario. Bad guys take over a blank, you know, and it's up to one guy to fight back. That sequence involves Wesley Snipes and his brother, both of whom are U.S. Marshals, fighting back against the terror thieves. Ultimately, his brother perishes in that sequence.
Malcolm Jamal Warner.
We're going to get into him.
A rainbow of an actor.
What a lovely presence. Yeah. Isn't he just lovely like, to be around, you know?
I was thinking how tough it has been with the horrible revelations about Bill Cosby.
You just can't go back there.
Yeah,
you can't go back.
It's hard to, because it was such a comfort blanket show. You know,
absolutely. I loved
everything
it.
aside, that movie, talk about like something that, you know, at least I grew up watching with my family and like was really integral and powerful about, like, you know, just being a kid. And so to see Malcolm Jamal Warner is like, it feels great.
It's almost like a cousin or something. It's like seeing an old cousin like you haven't seen for ages.
Totally.
That you have great memories with as a kid. Yeah.
Totally.
He really embodies something really warm and lovely.
I love seeing him. Anytime I see him, I get excited. And I wish he'd done more stuff like this.
Me too, because he's really good and he holds his own, you know, with Snipes. But the stuff towards the end of the movie was where the microscope got a little bit more specific, because there's a scene. Basically, the end of the movie culminates with a heist on the DEA building, which is orchestrated by Gary Busey and his team, and it's up to Snipes and his team to stop them. And that sequence involves some of the following moments that you may remember. A henchman being killed after a tussle on a stairwell where they fall down together and the henchman gets his neck broken, which is identical to the beat with Tony's death in Die Hard. We've got the hero dropping a corpse down an elevator shaft to mess with the bad guys.
I thought of that one.
Something I like to call corpse play. John McClane is a fan of corpse play. If you may recall, he drops with Tony with the Christmas sweater that he makes for him, and of course your boy Marco, who is dropped out of the building to alert Al Powell to the presence of the issues going on inside Nakatomi Plaza. So bit of corpse play.
We also can't forget the fact that Gruber falls out a window. That feels falling out windows and falling from buildings feel very important
and that,
to the
which
genre.
Is, spoiler alert, that is how Gary Busey meets his demise, by falling out of the skyscraper.
We love a little bit of defenestration, folks, don't we? It's just a great...
There's also the blonde henchman called Torsky, who kind of looks like Carl and eventually gets a Carl-style death where he gets entangled with a parachute and left hanging there.
Yes.
So then you got Mexican standoff with the hostages being used as human shields. There's even which is identical to the ending of Die Hard, and we've got an "oops, no bullets" moment as well for good measure. So there's Die Hard DNA all over the place. But there was also one in particular that you and I talked about that I thought was interesting. With when the bad guys take over the plane. They call in ahead of time to the cockpit and
as
say,
you do.
You're about, I'm not sure why they did that, but they say you're about to be taken over by
Posse Comitis.
Right.
Yeah.
So tell us a bit about that and its significance.
I should say that I heard that when I watched the film and had no idea what it was. And I need to give a shout out to former and hopefully future guest of the podcast, Jamel Bowie.
Absolutely.
Jamel Bowie's podcast, Unclear and Present Danger, which, if you haven't listened to that show, is like somewhat like our show, but like with way smarter dudes about politics and history. And they analyze action thrillers from the 90s through the lens of politics. And his co-host, John Gans, which explained, and I listened to their episode on Drop Zone, and as is typical, Jamel Bowie's like, I like this movie. Explain that Posse Comitis is essentially the idea that there should be no higher power in the country than essentially the county. So that means that, it's kind of in response to the Civil War and sort of like local groups saying like the military had too much power, and so that these groups have to work in tandem with local power, sheriff, county, whatever the case is. And as again, as John Gans explains it on the podcast, it's something of a far right cause, right? The idea of the sheriff or local law enforcement being more powerful than anything else, right? And there's a lot to unpack there about American history. But what's interesting in the case of this movie, in the same way that Gruber calls for the release of his like comrades in arms around the world as a smokescreen to steal a bunch of money, right? So Gruber pretending to be this like, political actor, but is actually just like a late 80s, thief. These guys are masquerading as right-wing figures, but are really just stealing money. Now, the thing that is interesting about this movie is that Busey is a honorably discharged DEA agent. So he has spent his career going after drug dealers and dismantling the larger, network, or in theory, the DEA is dismantling the larger network of illegal drug sales throughout the country, right? But it seems he's been somewhat radicalized by this job and has realized, there's a couple lines in the movie where he says things like, God bless America. Busey's so fucking good. And like, he clearly has lost any illusions that like the work he was doing was meaningful and was contributing to the world. So again, it's a bit of a political smokescreen. They're using politics as a smokescreen.
Exactly.
Whether it's real or not, it reads as an illusion.
And it serves their agenda because they don't want people to realize that their actual purpose is a prison break, which is to spring this hacker that they need for their master agenda. So they cloud the whole act in the idea that they're just a sort of almost a random terrorist group and the hijack's gone bad, whereas actually they have a secondary agenda.
By the way, did you notice in that scene they cut off his finger to make it look like he has died on the plane?
Yes, it bites it off, yeah.
Dark Knight Rises, they do the blood transfer in midair to make it look like the General Pavel has died on the plane. So again, like, I always wonder, like, is Christopher Nolan
This isn't a Dark
around?
Knight Rises podcast, Liam.
I know, but I just like the idea that he was, like, watching Drop Zone. He was like, how do I do this with Bane?
I love the idea of Nolan just chilling with a bucket of popcorn and
Dude,
watching
he
Drop
loves
Zone.
Talladega Nights. It's one of his favorite movies. Like,
it's his secret code for what he's at. It all comes back to Drop Zone.
I love it.
Who knows? Maybe so.
But, you know, I actually want to jump on something in this conversation that with the Die Hard DNA, if you'll have me, that I think there's something that this movie, well, I don't know if this is true, but let's talk about it anyways. I think there's something in the way that this movie advances some of the roles, the dynamics in an action movie. And I'm going to go back to Lethal Weapon to talk about this because it predates a little bit. And you probably can think of a million examples. But one of the things that even as a kid I recognized in Lethal Weapon is you have the main guy in that movie whose name escapes me. The main villain in Lethal Weapon is...
I think it's General McAllister.
It is General McAllister.
Is that right?
Yes, General McAllister. Very good.
Something like that.
And he has a henchman, Mr. Joshua, played...
Of course.
It's goddamn Christmas! Played wonderfully by Busey. And one thing the movie does is it sets up Mr. Joshua as Riggs's nemesis, not McAllister, right? McAllister kind of dies by explosion, you know, before the end of the movie.
Yeah. And Glover runs him over in the alley, and
he's reaching for the grenade, and it explodes.
He's got the movie's got 20 minutes to go, and he's out of the picture.
So the real bad guy is the square off is the legendary fight that would never ever be allowed in the front of the house where Riggs takes down Mr. Joshua. Lethal Weapon 2 does something similar where Riggs takes on, I forget his name, but the second in command of the racist South African diplomats. Yeah. In a way, and we've talked about this on our very first episode, Die Hard sets up McClane as it sets up Carl as McClane's sort of like actual physical adversary, right? Like, and so to get to the point, what I like about this movie is that it's a team movie. Wesley Snipes has a team and Gary Busey has a team, and the movie does a really great job of almost like setting up every character to have a doppelganger on the other side. And the thing that made me realize this is that Yancey Butler looks a little bit like her adversary on the other side. Like they're almost cast to look a little bit alike.
And they eventually have a fight, right?
And they eventually have a fight.
In the end, yeah.
And then Busey takes on Snipes. And what's interesting is that they both play guys who've lost their positions in their relative position of law enforcement, and they're both sort of like on the fringe of it. And then you have like Swoop versus Torski. Selly is kind of the sort of oddball is kind of the opposite of Leedy, the computer hacker. And the movie does this thing of almost setting up like one-to-ones, which like maybe other movies had done this, but like it really makes this strange effort to like set up mirror versions of these characters. And like, you know, I'm not saying this movie is necessarily like, actually the Unclear and Present guys do a great conversation about like what the movie could be saying about the world in 1994. That's really interesting. And you should listen to it for that. But it is really fascinating to me how like there's a one-to-one in this movie across the board.
Well, we are through the looking glass here, people, and we're going to go further down the rabbit hole right after this break.
We are back with our section, Anatomy of an Action Movie, in which we list the tenets. We live in a twilight world.
And there are no friends at dusk.
Of the action film Drop Zone. Phil, real quick, I just want everyone to know, my second purchase was the 4K UHD of Tenet, and
Why wasn't it your first? What was your first?
Oppenheimer. That's the one that you have to show everyone how the TV works, and also to have your wife be like, "Are you fucking?"
Isn't it funny how you think like I don't know if cinephiles like us are like this, where we imagine that we have to lay out our collection because we imagine at some point someone will look through them and judge us and judge our taste.
Well, because I do that. I actually have them in the back of the house.
No one gives it. No one gives a shit. No one really gives a shit.
Well,
but we're like,
except for other insufferable people.
I have to make sure I have Days of Heaven on here as well as fucking Boiling Point and Passenger 57, just so that they know that I got my shit together.
I go hard too. I go hard.
Exactly.
All right.
The premise of Drop Zone is thus. After a mid-air prison break results in his brother's death, U.S. Marshal Pete Nessip, played by Wesley Snipes, infiltrates the skydiving community in order to track down those responsible. He eventually uncovers the sinister agenda of skydiving master thief Ty Moncrief, played by Gary Busey.
Killer name.
What a name. I love that name.
Yeah,
incredible stuff. Who is a former DEA agent who is now attempting to steal the identities of undercover narcotics agents in order to sell them to drug traffickers. The ticking clock kicks in with the final heist on the DEA building in Washington, D.C. during the July 4th celebration. And that the clock is essentially, can Pete and the team stop Moncrief before he pulls off the final robbery and exposes the identities of multiple undercover agents? It does occur to me, just to your point, that there was another movie we talked about, Blown Away, that also used July 4th as to potentially make a point about America. I think in this point, because that was a film about immigration and your identity and
Boston and that's a big deal there, right? For the July.
So there was a cultural aspect to it, but there was also a sort of sense of like detaching from the old country and stamping your authority as something new. Here, I don't think I'm not going to say that Drop Zone is like making. I don't think it has this type of stuff on its mind. I think the July 4th celebration is a very clever plot point because it's about the idea that usually DC would be heavily secured and the airspace would be, no one can go near it. But for this particular
it's actually very
event,
smart in that sense.
Yeah, I think it's really clever, like plotting.
Well, and it also gives a spectacle. It lets the movie have a cool spectacle level to it that I think is great.
Are there any particular, for you coming in cold, because I say for me this is wrapped up in a world of nostalgia and memory and warm and fuzzy feelings from my youth. For you coming in cold, were there your general thoughts, like themes? Were there particular scenes or sequences that you really, really liked, that you had thoughts about?
That's a great question. My favorite scene in the movie is the early one between Wesley Snipes and Malcolm Jamal Warner when they're driving to pick up Leedy from the prison. And the reason it is because I think sometimes we all forget, especially in the context of talking about action movies, that Wesley Snipes is a great actor. He has always been a great actor, and starting with Spike Lee and the other films he did, and like
King of New York,
annihilating
in that,
and just like was such a presence, and I think people respect him and like him, but like he's never quite gotten, in my opinion, has never quite gotten the due that he's deserved. And one thing I love about Wesley Snipes, and this is true between him and Sizemore in 57. Is that there's always like a scene where Wesley Snipes gets to bullshit with a slightly annoying, like in the case of this movie, it's his brother. And in the case of, 57, it's Sizemore. Like,
Dan Hedaya in Boiling Point, he has the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
He's like his buddy, right?
He's always just like the smartest guy. He's just always a smart, cynical figure in these movies. Yeah. And like, I just love him. I think he's great. Obviously, we've this is our third movie with Wesley Snipes in him. So I love that scene. I will watch Gary Busey, like kind of in a weird way, like Cage before Cage, like a guy who just throws shit at the wall. I don't mean to compare them, but like Gary Busey is just not afraid to like wear Hawaiian shirts and go over the top and be ridiculous, and like is such a great figure. For me, it's like the Cage really. I'm sorry. Snipes really sticks out. Busey really sticks out. I think Yancey Butler's really, really great in this movie. And then my absolute favorite moment in the movie is a sequence. I'm not going to get into it now, but it involves gunplay that
Yes, we'll get
gets
into it
close
in a
to John,
subsequent section.
not
Yeah.
in quality, but has a open reference to John Woo. And I will say that the moment that I think is most amazing is when they're skydiving and the fireworks are going off in the background. Like, that is one of those moments where you're like, holy
That's
shit.
what I'm telling you, man.
They
Like,
don't
in
make
the
movies
theater,
like this anymore. Like,
it was
it's
and
just...
it's like 360 degrees. It's multi-dimensional. There's so
Yeah.
much like stimuli
Yeah.
going on. You know, it was really, really great, and it's all underpinned by this fantastic Hans Zimmer score. That just sends your heart soaring.
Well, we're
It's
doing
just
2 Hans Zimmer
brilliant.
scores in a row with our next movie. That's really interesting. Yeah.
And I mean, when I rewatched the movie fresh like a few months ago, and it began, and it was like the Paramount Pictures logo, and it was like Hans Zimmer with the slide guitar. It was a little bit of Thelma and Louise in there, and then there's this shot like
going over, that's
skimming over
yeah.
the I think I assume the Everglades. I think it's
Shades
in Florida.
of Clear and Present Danger, that or at Patriot Games where it
Mist
opens
on the trees, and there's this incredible font, and it's like dun, 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 dun.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh my gosh,
Well,
this is amazing. You know, I was
what's-
just so into it. You know,
I think what's so good about what you're saying is that, like, there's a genre. Movies like this don't get made on this scale anymore, and I'm not.
That's what shocked me. It was like, this is a Paramount movie. This isn't like a mini major studio, just like doing a little dirty programmer for 15 million. This is like a major release.
Well, and it's all
you know?
practical, and like, it's a movie for adults with action in it. It's not heavy. It's not complicated. There are things you can think about it and have 30-something minute conversations about it. Like, it feels like it takes place kind of in the real world, even though you can't bite someone's finger off. Like, there are things about it.
I don't know why
that,
they
like,
didn't just have like cutting shears for that or something. But
This is a
Busey
big
was like, no, let me bite him off.
Exactly.
People believe it because I'm Gary Busey.
I'm very Busey. like, there's, we mentioned earlier, and this, I'm a huge fan of the movie Oppenheimer. I love it.
Me too. Yeah.
I think it's a great movie. But I think there's something a little, and I don't want to sound like 40-year-old man yelling at cloud here, but like the fact that in a movie for adults like that, it's a spectacle and it's amazing. I think it's such a breath of fresh air because we're like, oh, we're watching a movie for adults. It's like both exciting and pulse pounding. I mean, like, the first hour of that movie is like him growing up. The second hour is like a heist movie about building the bomb, and the third movie is all the the courtroom drama, but also the regret and the reality of it. Like, it's this largest possible scale, right? And like, not that Drop Zone is comparable to Oppenheimer, but like there used to be like really fun 3-star action movies with incredible production value that you could just go see a movie and be like, that was cool, I had a good time with that. Like, and it just doesn't, I don't know, it doesn't quite happen like that in the same way anymore.
You wouldn't
even
really
if good movies are made, right?
A Paramount, when I think of Paramount now, it's the landscape has changed. That's why I was sort of pleasantly shocked to see, oh, this is a Paramount major release. It's glossy. It's Hans Zimmer. It's beautifully shot. It has a real sweep to it. It has huge production value. It has huge production value. A major star
good
at
actors.
the time. And filled up with a really good ensemble of actors. It's a little bit reminded me a little bit of our conversation with Sean Fennessy about Striking Distance, about how these were films that now are considered these sort of like kind of programmer action thrillers, but in those days they really threw money behind it. They threw resources behind it. They threw craftspeople behind it. They threw great actors into the mix and stuff. So for me,
not to tease our next episode too much, but our next film is Crimson Tide, and we'll talk about our guest at the end of the episode, but our guest is able to put the history of that movie and the actors in it in context, coming out of a rich tradition. And the same can be said for filmmakers and cinematographers and people, who shoot these movies, right? And produce these movies. Like, they're all coming from like real backgrounds and real training. And I think it makes a huge difference. Not to say that filmmakers aren't doing that now, but like, it was just, there was such a high degree of competency across the board to make a movie for $45 million.
And there has been a kind of clamoring, I think, as well for a return to these sort of what would be called sort of mid-level budget films, because it has tended to be sort of polarized to like 200 million tent poles and all the rest of it.
Well, it's also so much more expensive to make a movie now.
or low budget horror, right?
Yeah.
Like how to make something that's profitable.
The budget for this movie, if they were to make it now, would be way more than $45 million. It'd be crazy.
I would imagine so.
Anyway,
this is a really cool premise. What I love a movie that like takes you again. I just said like goes through the rabbit hole. This is about a character who is an outsider who goes into a subculture and learns to understand it. And that part of the movie is something I really, really enjoy. They go to that bar and there's a tradition where they ring a bell and have a toast every hour because a skydiver has died somewhere. And it feels like there's a world beyond the world that we're seeing, but it's like it's tight-knit. It's hard to penetrate. They sort of don't trust outsiders. It's a little bit like an undercover cop movie, even though he's actually... Yeah, there's a little bit of that. Yeah, where it's fun to be dropped into a world that feels like it's already existed and there's relationships and nuances and subtleties and fun, in that world, and we get to be sort of guided through it. So, there's so many aspects to this movie that I really enjoy. But let's move on to our section. You just teed it up beautifully, speaking about your love for Mr. Snipes, who I'm also a massive, massive, massive fan of. That's why I saw all these movies. I loved him. I'd watch all of them, and so he's the hero of this movie. Moving into our hero section, he plays Pete Nessip. How does this compare, in your opinion? I have thoughts on this, but I want to get your opinion first. How does he compare to the other action heroes that he has played recently around this time? E.g., John Cutter in Passenger 57 or John Mercer in Boiling Point. Is he any different?
I actually think he is. And, it's been a long time since I've seen Boiling Point. But Passenger 57 and Boiling Point, correct me if I'm wrong, but he's a little more brooding. He's a little darker in those movies. Here, it's like if my hand right here is Passenger 57 and my other hand is Demolition Man, there are moments in this where his comic chops come into play, his like Willie Mays Hayes, or like when he first skydives, and he's like kind of the suit gets all wet and he's just kind of a goofball. Like there's something a little lighter about this performance, but again, the moment when he loses his brother and after is like really heavy. So I think this movie highlights both his dramatic and comedic chops. And he's just a very capable action star. I think he's doing something a little lighter this time, but it still has some of the heavy.
Yeah, I mean, I would just wanted to look up. His name's Jimmy Mercer in Boiling Point. And
right.
I like to be sort of precise about these things. Yeah, John Cutter in Passenger 57. I find that unfortunately, with the action movies he did, there was not too much between them. There's not much you could say. Okay, how would you describe Pete Nessip as a character?
Yeah,
you would struggle to be like, he's a U.S. Marshal, right? That's it, kind of thing. And it's a little bit like that with Passenger 57. We know a bit more about him in that because we see that he's had this trauma and that his wife died in a bungled liquor store robbery or whatever it was, grocery store robbery. And you learn a little bit more about him. In this one, we really know very, very little about him. And it started to get to a point where it was almost like the movie is saying, you get it, right? You get it. Right. It's Snipes. You kind of know what we're.
It's leaning on the history of the genre or the character, or the actor.
Because you don't know, and he has no quirks. We know very little about his background except for the fact that he has his brother. So they do the same thing. A loved one is killed off, from the
second Malcolm and Jamal Warner shows up on screen, you're like, this guy's gonna die. Like, there's no way he makes it.
I remember when I first saw it, I was so thrilled to see him that I was like really shocked and disappointed that he died so early.
Well, you were a kid. I don't think you probably had the nuanced understanding of, despite writing a letter to the editor about your feelings.
I didn't actually write. I didn't send this letter. It was an essay I wrote at school that just disappeared somewhere. But I wasn't like that sort of angry about it, where I felt the need to call somebody out. Yeah. It was more like I just wanted to make a point. Like, why do people feel the need to do this? Because they're actually going to deny people joy. Mm-hmm. Was my, as a child, that was my take
now
on it.
Now you would just sound like a person on Twitter. Anyway,
well, exactly. Yeah, that wasn't my intention. Is to point to like attack somebody, not at all.
Right, of course.
But yeah, it's interesting that I mean, you could call them programmers. I don't like that. That's a sort of that's a derisive term. But these movies are.
What's a mid-tier action movie?
Yeah, in all of those kind of movies, he plays very similar characters, and yet outside of those lines, with a performance like we've talked about, Demolition Man, he is
great.
like. He's unleashed, and he's just so like, it's so vivid and it's so big and it's so powerful and there's such specific choices. Even his appearance with the blonde hair and, you know, all his the crazy mannerisms and stuff. But in these movies, he's almost like he's so underplaying it. He's so
that's
contained.
True. Yeah.
I think the sort of sweet spot for me is a movie that I considered as doing, but ultimately decided not to, was Rising Sun, because it's about a Japanese corporation in LA. You know, so it has the Nakatomi connection, and but it's really more of a mystery thriller than it is an action movie. It's now the reputation, and the first thing you have to say about Rising Sun is that its politics are problematic. You know, the book I think is largely considered to be even more so, and the movie's sort of somewhat watered down. But in that movie, he plays a cop called Webb Smith, but he does really have a character. He has complications in his backstory.
Yeah.
He took a bribe for very understandable reasons. He's not perfect. And he's also going into another, sort of through the looking glass, into another subculture.
Right.
Guided by Sean Connery as the Japanese cultural expert, and then goes into this world of this Japanese corporation. I think that's like a good example of a movie that he's playing a cop like he's played in all of these movies. And going on to Murder at 1600, which we'll also eventually cover, they all feel a little bit like they're cut from the same cloth. And I think it does him a bit of a disservice, because as we've talked about, he has such extraordinary range as a comic actor, as a dramatic actor, you know, doing movies that we like, The Fan and One Night Stand, where he can really do serious dramatic acting, and then the comedy stuff, Major League, White Men Can't Jump, all the rest of it. And most of these movies are it's like a little bit of a shame that he's so contained. You know, just because he's got so much more to offer as a performer, you know. So,
but these movies aren't
still great.
The thing that I think is fair to say is that, like, to be obvious, actors have different functions, right? And like an action movie is all about concept and execution, and like it leaving you breathless, right? So like you don't want to spend necessarily. I think he brings as much gravitas to it as he can. Right.
It's a little bit like the Liam Neeson movies of today, where the template was established in Taken, and every subsequent film is kind of similar because people are like, we like that. We like this type of character, and it's a sort of cultural shortcut for the audience to be like, we like this actor in this type of role, so let's give them what they want, and the rest of the phantasmagoria can play out around that planet, right? Like that planet is doing what it's doing. The rest of the solar system is going, and that's where you can have more fun with things like Busey or Yancey Butler. So let's move on to. Let's do Yancey first as the lady of this movie, because in many ways, she's kind of more of the hero to some extent. And I think she's amazing in this. And I was really, really struck by her performance.
Yeah, I think she's great.
3 months ago. She plays Jess Crossman, who is the skydiving expert that Wesley Snipes uses to basically infiltrate this world, or they kind of partner up. They end up having the same agenda, because her ex-lover was killed by Ty Moncrief. We come to discover basically they're kind of helping each other out. They both have sort of something to gain from it, so they kind of team up. I actually think she's the most dynamic and interesting character and performer.
She's given more time to do things, and she had like there's a whole part of the movie where when he's like kind of infiltrating it, where like we follow her around as she's investigating the murder of her partner, and I would just say that like she's cool, she's tough, she doesn't mess around, she's never a damsel in distress. And what I love about the movie at the end is that they have this final moment where I believe he's in like a hospital stretcher, right? Because he's been beaten up pretty bad, and she's leaning on him, and it could be romantic, but it is not romantic, right? Like it seems like by the end they like each other, and that's the biggest sort of takeaway, is that they have like mutual respect and like each other and like have become friends. It's not about them having any kind of romantic relationship.
And I found out something really interesting about that, which was apparently this character was originally written as a man, which is kind of interesting. And so I guess it maybe was a bit more of a buddy movie along the lines of Point Break, perhaps, right? Something like that. Anyway, what was really interesting about this is apparently, there's a complicated scene where Yancey Butler's character takes Snipes' character on a flight, and they get into an argument. And he kind of insults her, and she just pulls a lever, and
he falls out the bottom of the plane.
He falls out the bottom of the plane, right?
Totally.
And she then goes and gets him and saves him. But when they land on the ground, I don't know if he does. I don't think he does.
That's
because she has
crazy,
to go and save him with like a tandem jump, right?
Yeah.
But when they land, he punches her.
Yeah.
Now, and that's a moment that's pretty shocking, but apparently...
Let's be clear. He doesn't just punch her. He fucking lays her out.
Her.
Yeah, like it is a movie punch. It is like a Harrison Ford punch.
Yeah, it's no joke. And apparently Yancey Butler insisted that stay in, even though, because that was a hangover from a previous version of the script where the character was of Jess Crossman was a man. But she was like... They wanted to get rid of that because it's like, you can't have our hero, punching a woman. And she was like, no, he absolutely should. So I think that was really interesting. This film is, the sexual politics of this film are kind of crazy because of that conversation with Snipes and his brother at the start of the film. It has not aged well.
No, it has not. It's fun to watch because it's cool to their interplay, but it's cringy. It is way cringier than the punch. I think the punch is great. I think the punch...
It almost levels them. It's almost a weirdly
It's a mutual respect thing.
Equality thing in a crazy twisted way.
Yeah, no, and also it gets away from the thing that a lot of these movies have we've talked about how like maybe the maturest version of a movie is one that can, refer to itself. It's why I think Demolition Man is such a great movie, because Demolition Man is not just about, in Last Action Hero, those are movies that are like reflections of the character in them, right? They're meta commentary on action movies, right? And that's such like a sophisticated final version of the form. This is an example, this reminds me of Terminal Velocity in the sense that, like, they're kind of like, oh, this movie feels like it should have been made 3 years ago, right? Like, it feels like of a piece with just right after Die Hard, maybe closer to a Toy Soldiers or something like that. But that moment is great, not because he hits her, but because it implies that he's not doing the thing that action stars do in movies, which is like treat the wife like a secondary figure. And that calls, by the way, back to Die Hard, because Bonnie Bedelia in Die Hard is sophisticated and cunning, and like, even though Willis is saving her, she kind of doesn't need saving until the end when he does actually have to save her. Yancey Butler doesn't require saving in this movie, and I think the fact that they are on the same level,
he does,
is
literally
great.
She literally has to save him.
Right.
He's helpless. So I think that's really cool. I think
totally
she's
agree.
Great in this movie. I think it's a great character, really, really refreshing. And I think she's really alive as a performer, and I think she's terrific in this movie. I really, really like the performance and the character.
This movie also has Grace Zabriskie, who's a David Lynch mainstay, as the woman who runs the field. I really, really like her.
If you were going to go there.
Yeah. Well, that's all I want to say.
Is what I think of with her.
Which one?
Wild at Heart.
Oh, yeah, totally.
She's terrifying, right?
Yeah, she's scary. Yeah. I also really want to think it's interesting how the movie sets up these two teams, right? And Busey's team is all these kind of like shitty white people, and Snipes' team is like a black guy, a woman, a fuck up, a homeless guy, like an unhoused guy, like as like kind of the inverse to these like former law enforcement right-wing weirdos. So the equality that the movie presents in the character. Listen, maybe we're reading into it a little bit, but it's
I love
there
that.
And it's interesting.
It's true. Yeah, they're sort of the scrappy underdogs, aren't they? And the plane doesn't kind of work properly, and they're a little bit like they're sort of outside of society a little bit.
They live outside of the society totally. They're in this like sort of cluster
their
of people.
Own world, but there's something really like warm and lovely about that community, I think.
Right.
And they are like a little weird family, especially
Yep.
with like the Sally character, who's sort of like the kind of wayward son.
He's
that's
kind of the
sort
fuck up.
lovable.
He's like the fuck up sidekick.
He's so
Yeah.
lovable, you know. He's so likable.
Right.
And Grace Zabriskie is like the, you know, is the sort of like the
Matriarch.
aunt, or, you know, or maybe the matriarch.
She's a little
and
bit like
Jesse
Margaret
as well.
Colin's character in Terminal Velocity, though she
Yeah.
gets more screen time. You
sort
know,
of guardian of them all.
I also just think that like one thing that I miss is like the dusty setting home base of like, and this has the bar and like, you know, takes place in a few locations, but you think about like Terminal Velocity's airfield or Rocketeers. There was this thing that used to happen in these movies where like we'd hang out more at the headquarters of the team. You know, one of my favorite things about that first Avengers movie is the scenes that take place on their like big, I don't even know what that aircraft carrier thing where they kind of like talk about, like, I love that like stuff in these movies where we're like, oh, we're just hanging out with the team wherever they happen to be. And this film takes the time to establish like a milieu and a home base like Roadhouse, right?
Yeah,
like Terminal Velocity.
It is that. It
True
is that
Lies
sort of-
has this with the headquarters, right? Speed takes place on a bus, like these like not single location, but these kind of like insular environments. But none of it works without a scenery chewing villain like Gary Busey
It
as
needs it.
Ty Moncrief. You have a question here. Is Gary Busey miscast in this movie? I would argue that Gary Busey is never miscast in a movie because Gary Busey turns everything into a Gary Busey performance. And you might not hang with that, or you might hang with it, but it's always memorable and he's always great, even when he doesn't necessarily fit in the movie. And I do think the stoicism, to some extent, of Snipes makes Ty Moncrief work really, really well.
I agree. Again, you know, your Dark Knight thing, right? We've talked about, you need fire and ice, right? You need, if you have an internal protagonist like Batman who is very contained and contemplative and rarely histrionic, the villain needs to be larger than life and wild and crazy, and the complete opposite, like the Joker, right? So this is a little bit like that to some extent, in the sense that, yeah, Snipes tends to be pretty contained. He rarely kind of has emotional outbursts, even though he's experiencing a lot of emotion and grief, much like Batman, actually. So you need this villain that's just like absolutely cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs.
He's great. He's really, really good. No,
he's terrific. The reason I say he's miscast, just to qualify that question, is like, if you were to think of, well, this guy is a DEA agent and he's like a super skydiver, you maybe think of someone like really, really fit, right?
Busey
Like someone,
as a skydiver is truly hilarious.
do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
it's like the Rex
Totally.
Lynn thing. Like, you don't think of who we love. Absolutely
Rex
love Rex.
Lynn is
You don't
so
think of
good
him
in
as
this
being
movie.
like when I think of people who are skydivers, maybe incorrectly,
You
I
think
think
of
of
me.
people that are
Yeah.
like Liam, that are svelte and beautiful and and have six-pack abs, right? Like,
I definitely
think
have
of,
six pack.
you know, I think of it just on paper, it might sound like that is an outside the box choice, but it totally works. And as you said, Busey tends to bend films to his will,
Right.
especially in this era. He's just such an alive, inventive performer.
And he has a face. He's not nameless or faceless or anything like that. You know, like he does something. You know, it's weird but the I gotta stop. But the part I thought about and the contrast I thought about, and you brought up the Batman, is Tenet, because John David Washington, that movie is so stoic, right?
Yes.
And then you have Kenneth Branagh, who every time I watch that movie, I'm like, oh my God, this guy gets fucking better and better, because he just makes bold choice. He's awful in that movie. Like, you hate him. You hate his guts. But it's like the villains have the opportunity in these movies to go further than the heroes can, because the heroes have to remain like noble or whatever the case. You can't have a hero playing it like Gary Busey, right? He can be the sidekick like he is in Point Break, but he's never going to be the guy who's the lead, because you're like, this guy is a fucking lunatic, right? So yeah, I think he's great. And I like an actor bending a movie to their will. I think that's fun.
Yeah, he's a lot of fun in this movie. It's a really, really fun performance. He's got some great lines. We don't know too much about like why he flipped sides from being a DEA agent. We don't necessarily
I think he wants money.
Servicing drug traffickers. We never find that out. There's maybe that's the kind of thing where it's like a scene was cut, or maybe they just didn't care. The movie doesn't need it. We don't really need to know or understand his motivation for this type of movie. It could have been a more interesting film from a character standpoint if we knew that, but I don't think don't think it matters. The film is not interested in that. The film is interested in throwing one set piece and one stunt sequence after another, back to back to back, to get you into a sort of state of like a rapturous excitement, like I was at 13 years old. So why don't we just talk about the action? Stunning aerial photography combined with some, unfortunately, badly dated back projection. The reason that happens is, of course, as you alluded to earlier, most of the
Wesley Snipes can't jump out of a plane in your
for
movie.
Insurance
He's
reasons,
not Tom Cruise.
They can't do that, right? So for close-ups of the principal performers, they have to shoot with back projection. Unfortunately, the technology that's used for those back projection shots has not aged very well.
Yeah, but can I just say something? Can I just like go on a little bit of like a tangent here? Not a long one.
Tangent? When's this going to get to Tenet?
So the thing about Tenet, I think the thing that
or Lethal Weapon or Dark Knight Rises. Right?
Well, I think that the thing that I love about that kind of stuff that's aged badly is that you're like, it's a movie. It's not real, right? Like, it delivers when it really has to, and then any thinking person knows that Wesley Snipes isn't jumping out of a fucking plane, right? So it's like, to me, it's kind of like fun and quaint to see sort of the like, quote unquote, wires holding Peter Pan up in the play, right? Like, you know, it just kind of works, and like we've sort of jumped the shark in terms of having to be committed to realism in our action movies in a way. And that's not a criticism of action movies that come out now, but like I can handle a little bit of like quote unquote dodgy CGI or whatever that is, because everything else about it works. And it's like, you know, it just doesn't bother me. Like I'm like, oh, this is really pulling me out of the movie because I know it's a movie. I don't know. It's not as bad as like the verisimilitude of it doesn't. It's like, I know what I'm watching here, right? So I'm just not bothered by it. And I think people want things to be really realistic. I'm like, I'm just watching a movie and I know it. And that's fine.
Yeah, I forgive all that stuff. It doesn't sort of, doesn't really bother me. I do think it's worth touching on, you know, we talked a lot about how incredible the aerial photography is, how immersive that stuff is. But I did want to talk to you a little bit more about this final sequence in the skyscraper because of the John Woo-ness.
Yes.
And especially because when I was just rewatching it this morning, there's a moment where there's this great sequence where it almost feels like, this reminds me as a screenwriter, when sometimes you're racing to finish a script, right? And if you're lucky, you're beamed into some higher force that is just inspiring, and you're just like bashing stuff out. You're just almost, because once you get towards the end, it's almost like running a race where you can see the finish line. You just start writing crazier and crazier and crazier and faster stuff to get, because you can see the ending. And this movie has that energy towards the end. As things progress, it gets sort of slightly ragged in a really fun way.
I see what you mean.
You know, and there's this great sequence where Snipes and Busey are either side of this sort of bank of computers, taking shots at each other. And that bit was like, holy shit, this is like really, really cool and different from everything else we've seen, right? It feels a little bit it felt in the world of action movies, it felt weirdly realistic, if that makes sense. You know,
even though it's stylized, it's like, and it's like, it's the John Woo, it's like the sequence when they're going down the hallway in Hard Boiled, right? It's like the guns are extensions, they're like swords, right? So like they're kind of using them in that dynamic way, and like it's out of control and it's crazy and it's like up close and personal, and
there's
like
a desperation to it, I think, as well, for the characters that it doesn't feel like clean and everything is like pre-planned. It's like for both characters, the plan is kind of out the window, and it's literally about to go out the window in a second. But there's this great sequence that was very John Woo-like. And when I was watching it again, where they're taking shots at each other, and then eventually they confront each other across the desk at the same time, aim their guns at each other point blank, and there's a little underpinning of the Hans Zimmer score that echoes Broken Arrow that would come out 2 years later, which a movie I saw like 3 times at the theater. I'm
Broken Arrow.
Obsessed with it.
The Southwest is going to be a quiet neighborhood for about 10,000 years. It's so good. Stuff, it's so good.
You know? So it's interesting from that standpoint. But there's actually some great like gunplay in that sequence. So I like that it goes from. I suppose what I'm saying is I like that it goes from a gigantic scope to something really intimate.
Well, I also think that, like, something that's interesting to me is, like, you and I, like, have talked off the air about how, like, we love action movies, but we don't love guns. Like, we're not interested in guns as people. Like,
not at all.
Pretty pro gun control in my life. Like, it's just my attitude is that I don't necessarily, like, I don't love guns, but I love John Woo, and I love John Woo because the gunplay in John Woo movies is, like, preposterous, right? Like it's so unnatural and unrealistic, and I love that. I love when it's like unrealistic in a movie and it's almost operatic because you're like, it's a metaphor, it's extension of character, and like this movie just goes for it in that moment, and it feels like different than, say, some of the other sequences. Like, you're having fun in that moment, right? And I think that's great. And I just like how it that moment really popped for me. Like, it's one of the few things I wrote down watching the movie. Like, oh wow, like the John Woo of this is.
The last 20 minutes of this movie are pretty great and pretty exhilarating and grounded, actually. Literally and figuratively. Did you pack? Are you wearing a tuxedo as well as your parachute?
I'm wearing a tuxedo that is a parachute.
Oh, cool. That's cool.
Yeah, the budget on this episode is just out of control. So
I'm wearing a Tron-style like tuxedo parachute thing that lights up.
Yeah, and you bit off someone's finger to get ready for the next.
And I'm going to land on what theater is it where they have the Oscars? Kodak?
The Dolby.
I'm going to land on the roof of that. So
let's do the Die Hard Oscars, aka the Action Movie Awards, presented by Phil Gawthorne and whatever tape they put on Letty's finger to stop the bleeding when they bit his finger off.
Well, speaking of that, the first award is the John McClane Yippee-Ki-Yay Award for Best Line. And my first nominee is, "Thank you. You threw me out of a plane and bit off my finger." To which Busey responds, "You have 9 good ones." As the way that only Busey could do. Then there's the line, people probably told you that Jesse Crossman was the only person skilled enough to jump from a 747, to which Snipes responds, well, the actual phrase was dick-brained, which I enjoyed.
That's a great line.
And then I love this one because it had a maniacal laugh at the end of it. And I love a little bit of maniacal laughter.
You love a maniacal laugh.
It's Busey's line, "These narcs are walking around thinking they're alive."
That's it. That one takes it.
I love that. What's crazy is that was his job. Like, those were his colleagues. Yeah. He did that. He was a DEA agent. I really love. There's something really sort of existentially dark and interesting about that line in a low-key way.
Well, he doesn't, no, this movie doesn't trust authority, right? Like, the one authority figure, who's the actor who's in Under Siege, whose name I forget, is kind of like, doesn't believe Snipes, doesn't know what's going on until the end.
Andy Romano.
Andy Romano, who's great
plays
actor.
the admiral in Under Siege, and is the judge in The Fugitive.
Fugitive, right. Yeah, he's a great Andrew Davis.
He's sort of his mentor.
Andrew Davis. Yeah,
Snipes'
Andrew Davis, come on the pod. Andrew Davis, come on the pod.
Absolutely. I have a bonus worst line as well, which is explosives, nylons. You dating that Mongolian feminist again? It's just that dialogue is shocking. And what I found crazy about that, though, just to pin this down for a second, was what was really wild was the idea that feminism was something in a mainstream movie in 1994. The idea that someone being a feminist was like absurd. When in my mind, it's like, shouldn't this be just a precept as the norm?
I'm picturing Suzanne Billingham hearing that line in the background of me watching this movie when I'm 14 and being like, this movie sucks. Yeah, I could just hear it,
So I did want to call that out.
Yeah, totally.
But yet, weirdly, even though that line is absolutely like shocking and repellent, the movie I think is a weirdly feminist movie because of Yancey Butler.
Well, and also
character.
You could argue that part of his character arc in the movie is like learning to trust this woman and be part of part of his growth.
That's true. Actually, it is, because what his brother's saying to him in that scene is like, he says, I want the women that are boring, and his brother is saying, no, you need someone who can run with the wolves, and that's what he actually finds with Jess Crossman, but yet it doesn't cross the line to.
It doesn't become about romance. Maybe it does. We don't know.
But it does
I like a movie that doesn't
change his perception of women.
Yeah, totally.
Which is kind of interesting. But let's move on to the Hans Gruber Exceptional Thief Award for stealing the film.
Who are our nominees, Phil?
I have 5. Yancey Butler as Jess Crossman, Gary Busey as Ty Moncrief, Corin Nemec as Sally, who's the likable young kid who
he's good.
Is sort of, as you said, is sort of a bit of the fuck up, but is sort of really, really charming.
Totally.
Kyle Secor as Swoop.
Swoop's good.
Swoop.
And
Malcolm Jamal Warner as Terry.
Wait a minute. No Michael Jeter as Letty?
I throw him in.
I'm throwing him in there. No, I think that this movie has actually a lot of like, potential
scene stealers, right?
Michael Jeter's always a welcome presence in a movie. He's in Tango and Cash. He's in Miller's Crossing. He's in your favorite Sister Act 2, Back in the Habit. That's the next podcast you're going to launch. No, he's just a great actor, but I do ultimately think I have to give it to Malcolm Jamal Warner because he just shows up on screen and you're like, I feel good and warm, and that's what makes ultimately his death sad.
What a gift as a performer when someone can say, when you see them on screen and you feel warm.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful thing, isn't it? So yeah, shout out to him. Let's move on to the Dick Thornburg Award for Dick of the movie. My nominees are
Grace Zabriskie.
The incredibly insensitive FBI agents at the crash site who are like berating Snipes.
Yeah.
Like after his brother has just died and he barely survived like a midair hijacking that led to multiple civilian deaths.
Yeah.
Like, and they're like laughing at him and shit and just they're awful.
That's a good choice.
I actually have Nessip's boss, Tom McCracken, who's played by the aforementioned Die Hard on a Blank all-star Andy Romano.
Right.
He's just a classic give me a badge and gun.
Yeah.
Kind of character. And he's actually kind of a terrible mentor. He's also quite handsy. If you look at him, he's kind of like,
really.
If you watch his performance throughout the film, he's like putting his hands on Snipes like quite a lot in ways that made me like slightly uncomfortable about his profession. I don't mean that in
of course.
I'm not being serious.
It's the part,
but
right?
It's a weird thing because he's kind of like avuncular and he's sort of his boss, and then when he needs him, he also is like kind of like just not that helpful. And it's like, if that's the kind of character for me where it's like, going back to Roadhouse, it's like, you want your Sam Elliott there. You want your ride or die bro.
Right.
And he's just not that. He's like,
kind of
I'm kind of your boss, and I kind of suck, and I'll help you a little bit, but I also am going to suspend you and not have your back.
Maybe also the movie's trust of anyone in an actual position of law enforcement, like, Snipes
he kind of represents those
shitty FBI agents that you just mentioned.
Yeah.
Like, the
speaking of Die Hard, by the way, shitty FBI agent.
Right. What if Paul Verhoeven, Ding Ding Ding, had directed this movie?
You just shoehorn that in for bingo.
I love Paul, man. I love Paul. He's my guy.
Then I have the skydiving bad guy Jagger, played by Luca Bercovici, and Ponytail Man. Shout out to Ponytail Man.
Oh, Ponytail
Detective
Man.
Fox of Miami Metro, played by Ed Amatrudo, who's the guy who's like the rat on the inside. Who's
he
like,
sucks.
The ponytail alone. And he's...
You don't like this ponytail I got for the podcast? Is that what you're telling me?
When people have, they're bald, they have a receding hairline, and they have a ponytail, that's tough.
It's a tough look.
That's a tough one for me.
You're trying... Yeah.
And you're a corrupt cop.
That might seal the deal. It might be him, but I'm going to go with Andy Romano, the character, not the actor.
Yes,
because I like a little shout out. I also think he has a great face, and also, did you know that he made most of his money playing in Annette Funicello and Frankie Avalon Beach Party movies in the '60s? Like, that's what he did, and then when that ended, he kind of like did a lot less acting and then kind of came back. And like, I always love when someone is a mainstay of the Andrew Davis verse, and I like that, and they all have good faces, and God, I just want to talk about Andrew Davis movies.
I know. The Package, guys, watch The Package. It's great. Best death is by the way, sorry, I just jumped into that. Let me back up. Let me beep beep beep.
Wait, I'm going to try to do it with a Gary Busey. I'm going to try to do a Gary Busey. No more table
driving. I'm just checking my headset. Is Marco in the house? Is he here?
How do you do it with a Gary? I can't. No more table. Next time you have a chance to kill someone, don't hesitate.
That's the best death presented by Marco. He's just parachuted in with a finger in his mouth.
Oh.
This is a surprising an excessively violent film.
It is quite violent.
I was really shocked by some of the needlessly brutal deaths. Like in that hijack, there's like a flight attendant is picking up the phone. Like, who's she going to call? As if it's like, oh, I'm going to call the sky cops. Like, what harm is she possibly doing? And one of the hijackers is like, no phones, and just shoots her dead.
Yeah, it's excessive. The early deaths are excessive. But it's woo-ish. It's woo-esque.
Yeah, it's like this movie doesn't fuck around in the way that like Terminal Velocity, we talked about how it's more PG-13. This movie is like a pretty hard R movie. There's like people getting their throat cuts. My 3 nominees for best death are Jagger parachuting into the power lines, courtesy of Ty Moncrief.
Right, that's a good
Busey,
one.
like drags him in there and leads him to his death. Hot henchwoman's apparent death by photocopier. That's
a good one.
Claire Stansfield as Kara.
She's good. I like her.
She's really good.
Yeah, she's really good.
I remember her from Frasier. She had a really good part in Frasier.
She was also on Xena, Warrior Princess, which makes sense because she's kind of like tall and sort of like Wonder Woman-esque. You know, she's tall.
And then Ty Moncrief diving off the building and crashing headfirst through the truck's windshield. Notice how that when the physics of that. So Snipes grabs Busey. They jump out of the building together, right? Busey doesn't have a chute. Snipes does. So Busey would fall to his death a la Gruber, and yet when he crashes through the dump truck, he's like flying.
Yeah.
Basically, I know he's a skydiver, but the physics of it are literally impossible. But it kind of works for the absurdity of where the film has got to at that point, you know? So those are my 3 choices. Do you have a
I'm going to go with Busey because it is. I rewound it and watched it a second time. I was like, this is nuts, the way he just goes into the window of this car. I think that's a good choice.
All right. Well, we will take a very short break, and then we're going to come back to you with a rejuvenated, rejigged, exciting new version of the Double Jeopardy trivia quiz.
I don't know anything about this, so we'll
have to.
I think we'll be right back, unless we cancel the podcast. We'll be right back.
Welcome back. We are moving on to our final section of the show, which is the Double Jeopardy trivia quiz, where the scores can really change. Now, I mentioned before the break that there was going to be a slight tweak. A slight tweak. And we're now adding a prize to the quiz. Just to spice things up a bit. This week's prize is the identity of every undercover narcotics agent in the Miami-Dade area contained on this 1990s computer disc.
I thought you were going to send me like a all expenses paid vacation to like Tahiti or something. This is just a fake present. Also, this is a nice precursor.
Listen, I'm tapping it on the mic right now. This is that computer disc.
It's a nice precursor to the knock list, I suppose.
It's a street value of $20 million adjusted for inflation. You can do with that as you wish, but you need 3 out of 3 to get it. Okay? All right. Question number 1. Director John Badham is no stranger to aerial action. Which 1983 helicopter-themed action movie did Badham also direct?
Oh, I need a clue, because I know.
We calling Al?
Yeah, call Al.
You phoning a friend? All right, we're calling Al. The film stars Roy Scheider, Daniel Stern, and Malcolm McDowell, and focuses on the LAPD's fictional Astro Division.
Blue Thunder
is the correct answer.
I've never even seen Blue Thunder, and yet I knew.
Dude. So good? Blue Thunder is like Philly special to the max. It sounds like it. It is so beyond my jam. It is not even funny. It's absolutely incredible. On my friend Andy Marano's podcast, the Andyplex, I did a whole deep dive on Blue Thunder. So you can find that. It's one of my all-time. I actually think it's the most underrated action movie of the 80s.
Do you have the 4K? Can I borrow it?
It's spectacular.
Cool.
No, it's in a vault that I don't allow anybody to
it's your touch. Fort Knox. Fort Philly.
All right, next question.
Fort Phil would have been funnier. Damn it. Okay, next.
Next question. Who is the only actor in the film who actually performed their own skydiving stunt for real?
Michael Jeter
is correct.
I also looked at the Wikipedia, Phil. Actually, maybe that wasn't there. I don't know, but I got it somewhere.
I
Oh,
did.
cool.
No, I did countless phone interviews.
I'm one.
How
You're doing
dare
a-
you?
you're doing
How
a-
dare you, sir?
You're doing a 50 episode making
How dare
of
you
a
come
drop.
in here and bark at me like some little junkyard dog?
That's really
I am
good.
the host of Die Hard on the Black.
Oh my God, you are wound up. How many cups of coffee have you had today?
Two.
Oh, wow.
All right, let's move on to convoluted corner.
Corner.
We are officially unhinged. Okay.
Yes.
Two of the actors in this film, Kyle Secor and Clark Johnson, both starred in an acclaimed and long-running 1990s cop show set in Baltimore, Maryland. Can you name that television show?
The Corner.
Is incorrect.
Clue?
The clue is this show focused on the murder unit, and its incredible cast also included Yaphet Kotto, Richard Belzer, Andre Brower, Melissa Leo, and Ned Beatty.
Embarrassing that I got that wrong. Homicide: Life on the Street.
Yes, is the correct answer.
Great.
Were you a big fan of that? Because
No.
I'd love to just talk about
My
that for a
parents
second.
watched it, I think, or my dad did. My family was a big Hill Street Blues family. But Homicide might have been a little too hard for them. But I mean, huge precursor to, everything, The Wire and all these other things that come after it that are really, really important. Yeah.
It was an incredible show. I loved it, and it was weird because I was thinking I must have been pretty young when I was watching.
Yeah, no,
it.
you
It's
had to
pretty
have been.
hardcore.
Yeah.
It's pretty grim. And
Philly, do you want to watch some cartoons? No, Mom. Put on
unbelievable.
Homicide: Life on the Street.
Fucking hey, turn that shit off. Like
I don't want to watch that crap, Mom. I like how your mom wasn't. He was like, I don't know about Home Alone, but I'll definitely let you watch Homicide: Life on the Street. That seems reasonable.
I don't think they knew the full extent of what I was.
Well, God bless
watching.
the days when you could let your children, when I could get away with watching whatever I want, because my parents were like, "We're busy. Go enjoy yourself."
So unfortunately, you didn't get the full marks, which means you don't get the main prize, but you do get a booby prize.
I got all three right.
No, you didn't. With some coaxing, you guessed the corner. No. Well, the rules are very strict. This is a $20 million valuation for this disc. You win the booby prize, which is the green shell suit.
You're a booby
worn
prize.
by,
This podcast is over.
worn by the skydivers in the bar who rough up Snipes, because that is a rough look.
He kicks their ass though.
One of those is being sent to you in the mail.
Thanks,
so
great.
you
I'll
can
look
wear
out for that. You fucking.
So that's the main thing. The moving on to our final thoughts, of this movie. There was something I did want to say, about my my feelings about this movie. And how I was sort of affronted by this review, because Roger Ebert's review, which I just wanted to quote real quick. Now, usually I would never do this, but I think it's relevant because what I really loved about Roger Ebert,
well, he's the best. That's part of what
he met a film where it was supposed to be met,
yes.
right? Like he wasn't trying to compare Drop Zone to the Magnificent Ambersons, right? He wouldn't look down on things, right? He's trying to say this movie is made for this audience that like this type of film.
Totally.
On that level, does it succeed or fail, in my humble opinion, right? And he said, Drop Zone is one of those thrillers where the action is so interesting that you almost forgive or even forget the plot.
Right.
The movie is virtually one stunt after another, many of them taking place in midair, and during the pure action sequences, you simply suspend your interest in the story and look at the amazing sights before you. So God bless you, Rog.
The kids would call that vibes. Drop Zone has good vibes. It's not about the story, it's about the vibes.
So I have nothing else to say about the film. I have something else to say about our couple of other things that I have going on, if I may.
You may.
I wanted to plug something.
Let's plug it. Plug away. Plug.
So have you seen a film from 2018 called Destroyer, starring Nicole Kidman?
I have not seen it, but I'm familiar with it, and I've heard it's great. Somehow, I don't know. I don't see all the things I used to see.
So,
but it feels like Philly special. Feels like Philly special.
Oh boy, it absolutely is it's an absolutely ferocious, spectacular neo-noir with a earth-shattering performance from Nicole Kidman that will make you completely rethink.
Good actress.
Anything, like just extraordinary work. I've never seen her do anything this raw, and it's just unlike anything that she's ever done. She's always been amazing, but this is like a truly spectacular performance. And I was invited onto a podcast called An Invitation Productions to talk about the movie. And I just want to read what this lovely gentleman, Jim, had to say, basically how he prefers it to be described, which is thus: An Invitation Productions is a narrative critical podcast that adapts and analyzes the work of Karen Kasuma through a series of dramatic readings and audio essays. Host Jim Panola has already recreated the entirety of Kusuma's cult thriller The Invitation as an unabridged audio drama, and is currently doing the same with the director's 2018 neo-noir Destroyer, marrying adaptation with vulnerable film analysis in the process. So I appear on the latest episode of the companion series, which is titled Ellipsis, where Jim interrogates Destroyer further through in-depth conversations with avowed fans, film critics, and the creators of Destroyer itself. I also spoke with one of the screenwriters ahead of recording. And in our episode, we filter Destroyer through the unique and influential lens of William Friedkin's masterful To Live and Die in LA.
Ooh, good movie.
If you're interested in that conversation, search for An Invitation Productions. And by the time this episode comes out, I believe it should be up there, and hopefully we'll be able to drop it in the link. It was a really fun conversation about a movie I absolutely love that is somewhat underseen, even though it's
definitely
like
underseen. Nobody's seen
critically worshipped,
yeah.
but it's not sort of not widely seen, and it should be, because it is a truly incredible movie.
You know who can act? Fucking Nicole Kidman can fucking act. She's an amazing actress. Well, that's cool. I don't have anything that good. I'm still on this podcast though. And if you're still listening to this podcast, because we apparently can go long on Drop Zone, please rate, review, subscribe, tell a friend. Hey, look, you got to tell a friend. Tell them about the show. Everybody loves Die Hard. Everybody wants to learn more about Die Hard. Everybody loves Drop Zone. You can reach out to us at Liam. I'm on Twitter, Liam G. Billingham. Phil, you on Twitter these days?
I'm getting a little bit more involved, and I'm thinking of doing some. We might have already done it by this point. Some live tweeting, some live Xing of a few cult movies that I love that we maybe not going to be covering on the show. So if you're interested in that, or if there's a movie that you would be interested in me or Liam or both of us,
okay, I'll do Tenet.
A live
fine,
tweet,
I'll do Tenet. It's fine.
Let us know. You already did that with Bilga, didn't you?
No, we just talked about it. Oh, that's a good idea, though.
You should plug that.
We should plug that. Yeah, it's on the other feed. I'll put a link in the notes. And you can reach out to the show at DieHardOAB on Twitter. We got a really nice Twitter comment in response to our The River Wild episode that I'm going to read because I love some good press. This is from The Curiosity Hour on Twitter. The Curiosity Hour is a podcast, a weekly hour-long podcast dedicated to finding out what it means to live with authenticity, courage, vulnerability, and purpose. And what the Curiosity Hour said is, the thing I love about Die Hard on a Blank is how unabashedly in love with the movies they talk about they are. Philip Gawthorne and Liam Billingham have made me want to rewatch so many movies. Definitely check this show out. Thank you. What a nice thing to say.
That's what we try and do.
Yeah,
right?
we love the movies. That's all I got. Oh, I do have one more thing. Next time on the show, Tony Scott's masterpiece, Crimson Tide, starring Denzel Washington and Gene Hackman, and with special guest on our show, Isaac Butler, who is a theater artist and cultural critic and wrote, in my opinion, the best book I read in 2022, The Method, which is about the history of method acting. And Isaac is going to help contextualize Gene Hackman and Denzel Washington's performances and why Crimson Tide is really a great actor's movie more than it is a great action movie, even though it is a great action movie. So I'm really excited for you all to hear that conversation. Isaac is great.
So we have a great conversation with him about Crimson Tide coming up for you on next time on the show.
All right. We'll be back next time with Jack Kirby's Silver Surfer. Is it the best one?
Bye, guys.
Is your vehicle stopping like it should? Does it squeal or grind when you brake? Don't miss out on summer brake deals at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
Oh, 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 O'Reilly